All right, so get this right. It's election season in Florida. And, well, it's always a bit of a wild ride down there. But this year, there's this First Amendment case that's really got people fired up. And it's got everything: abortion rights, a really powerful political ad, and a judge who did not mince words. We are diving right into the thick of it all.
Yeah, it's one of those situations where you can really see those big picture issues colliding.
Exactly, and that's what makes this deep dive so fascinating. So to set the stage for our listeners, can you give us a quick rundown of Amendment 4? That seems to be at the heart of this whole thing.
Sure. So Amendment 4 is on the ballot in Florida, and it's basically aiming to overturn the state's current 6-week abortion ban. The goal is to enshrine abortion rights in the state constitution, which would be a huge shift.
A huge shift, especially given the current political climate in Florida.
Absolutely, and that's why this case has drawn so much attention. It's become this flashpoint in the larger debate about abortion rights.
Okay, so we've got this amendment on the ballot, and then what? How does the ad come into play?
Well, the group that's backing Amendment 4, Floridians Protecting Freedom, they released this really powerful ad. I'm sure many of our listeners have probably seen it. It features a woman named Caroline, a brain cancer survivor, and she talks about her own experience and how this law, if it had been in effect, could have had devastating consequences for her.
It's a pretty emotional ad, really pulls at the heartstrings. But I imagine that's kind of the point, right?
Right. It's a very deliberate strategy, using personal stories to connect with voters on an emotional level. But what's interesting is how the state reacted. They didn't just disagree with the message, they tried to shut it down completely.
Yeah, that's where things get really interesting, right? The Florida Department of Health, which, by the way, is part of Governor DeSantis' administration, comes out swinging. They're calling the ad false, dangerous, even threatening legal action against any TV station that dares to air it.
And this is where the judge's response, and specifically this idea of viewpoint discrimination, becomes so central to the case.
Okay, so I have to admit, viewpoint discrimination, it sounds kind of like legal jargon to me. Can you break that down for those of us who aren't constitutional law scholars?
Sure. Basically, what it means is that the government, in this case, the Florida Department of Health, can't try to silence a particular viewpoint simply because they don't like it. They're essentially saying, we don't like this message, so you can't air it. And that raises some serious First Amendment concerns.
Especially in the middle of an election. It feels like a dangerous precedent to set.
Exactly. The judge is essentially saying you can't just suppress speech because you disagree with the message, especially during an election. That's a fundamental principle of free speech.
And the judge certainly didn't hold back in his response. I mean, it's not every day you hear a judge use that kind of language.
No, you're definitely right about that. I mean, his response to the state's attempt to block the ad was basically, it's the First Amendment, stupid.
Yeah, mic drop moment right there.
Yeah.
But tell me, beyond that incredible soundbite, what did the judge's ruling actually do? What actually changed?
So the judge issued what's called a temporary restraining order against the Florida Surgeon General. In practical terms, that means the state can't do anything to stop TV stations from running the ad until at least October 29th.
Which I'm sure is no coincidence, right?
Yeah.
October 29th being just 1 week before the election.
Very interesting timing, for sure. But here's the thing. This isn't a final ruling. It's like hitting the pause button while the court figures out the bigger picture here.
It's like a legal cliffhanger.
Yeah.
But in the meantime, even this temporary restraining order could have a huge impact, especially this close to the election.
Absolutely. It brings a whole new level of attention to the issue, and in a race this tight, any little thing could sway voters.
It'll be interesting to see how this all plays out. But let's not forget, it's not just about the legal battle here, is it? There's also this debate about the ad itself and whether or not it's accurate.
Right, and that's another layer to this whole thing. You've got the state claiming this ad is totally false, but then you have medical experts pushing back against that, saying, hold on a minute, this law is deeply flawed, and here's why.
So it's like we've got this whole other debate happening alongside the free speech issue. So how do these different perspectives actually play out in the sources we've got for this deep dive? Give us the details.
Yeah, so one of the sources we looked at for this deep dive was a report by Physicians for Human Rights, and they did not hold back. They called the ban unworkable, said it would lead to preventable suffering. They even went so far as to say it undermines medical ethics, which is a pretty serious claim.
Wow. Yeah, that's a pretty damning assessment. It really highlights how this isn't just some abstract legal debate. It has real-world consequences for doctors and patients.
Exactly. And it gets even more complicated, believe it or not, when you bring in the case of John Wilson. He was actually the general counsel for the health department, the one who sent out those cease and desist letters.
Oh, wow. So the guy who was trying to get the ad pulled is now. What happened?
Well, not long after this whole thing blew up, John Wilson resigned. And his resignation letter was interesting, to say the least. He wrote, "A man is nothing without his conscience." Now, he didn't come right out and say it was because of the controversy surrounding the ad, but it's kind of hard not to see the connection.
You have to wonder if watching this clash between free speech and the state's stance on the ad played a role in his decision. It makes you think.
For sure, it really underscores the personal and ethical dimensions of this whole thing. This isn't just about laws and politics, you know.
Exactly, and that's what I love about these deep dives. There are always so many layers to peel back. So, with all that said, how does the judge's defense of the First Amendment, that whole stupid quote everyone's talking about, how does that fit into the bigger picture of free speech in your view?
Well, that's what makes this case so fascinating, right? The judge's ruling, even if it's temporary, it really underscores a core principle of free speech in this country. He's saying the government shouldn't be in the business of deciding what people aren't allowed to hear, especially during an election.
Which, let's be real, is a time when open debate and access to information are supposed to be paramount. But at the same time, it can't be a complete free-for-all, can it? There have to be some limits, especially when it comes to public health messaging, right?
You're right. It's a really tricky balance. Where do you draw the line? How do we protect free speech, even speech that's controversial or maybe even inaccurate, while also making sure people aren't being misled, especially about important stuff like health issues? It's a tough one.
Definitely a tough one. Because if the state can suppress this ad based on their interpretation of the facts, what's to stop them from censoring other things? Where does it end? It's a slippery slope.
It is, and that's exactly what makes this case so important. It's not just about this one ad or this one election. It's about some really fundamental questions. Free speech, government power, who gets to control the narrative. It's really relevant in the age of social media, right? Misinformation spreads so quickly.
It's almost overwhelming when you think about it.
Yeah.
So where does that leave our listeners? We've got these legal battles, these heated political debates, conflicting opinions from experts. It's a lot to process. What are we supposed to make sense of all this? I know, right? It's like, where do we even begin to unpack all of this?
It's a lot, for sure. But I think if we take a step back, there are a few big questions we can really sink our teeth into. Like, what's the government's role when it comes to making sure people have the right information, especially about health stuff, during an election? Where do you even draw that line?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Because on the one hand, you've got this concern about misinformation, but then on the other hand, you have this whole censorship thing. It's like, who gets to decide what's true?
Exactly. And that's what makes this case so fascinating, right? It forces us to really examine those big, important democratic principles. Free speech, accountability, access to information, and how do we balance all of that in a way that makes sense?
Which, let's be real, it's way easier said than done.
Way easier said than done.
But hey, that's kind of the whole point of these deep dives, isn't it? It's not about us having all the answers. It's about looking at these complex issues from all sides and saying, okay, what do you think?
It's about giving you, the listener, the information you need to form your own conclusions. How do these issues affect you, your community? What's your take?
And I think even more importantly, how do we even start having these conversations, like with our friends, family, coworkers, without it turning into a huge argument? Because let's face it, these are tough issues.
They really are. And this whole case, as messy as it is, it shows us why it's so important to stay informed, to think critically, and, be open to different points of view.
Especially because this whole thing is far from over, right? We've got the election coming up. This legal battle is still going on. The debate about free speech and public health, that's not going away anytime soon.
So as you're following this story, as you're thinking about these issues, remember, there's always more to learn, more to consider. Don't just take our word for it. Go check out the sources yourself, do your own research, form your own opinion.
Exactly. And who knows, maybe you'll find something we missed. That's the thing about a deep dive. It's just the beginning of the conversation. So until next time, keep asking those tough questions, keep those conversations going, and we'll see you on the next deep dive.